Hey everybody, it's Jason from the Texas Gun Vault, and today I want to come to you with a video about Glocks, and more specifically the different generations of Glocks and the different options that you might find on Glock pistols out in the wild. Now these are just a few guns of my personal collection, and now there are going to be a few caveats to this video. The first caveat is I do not own an example of every minute option of the Glock pistol, so there's something that I might leave out or not be able to show you in today's video. The other thing is that I am speaking completely off of the top of my head and not using any notes. So when it comes to each one of these guns, there might be something that I neglect to mention. So if I do forget something, please add that in the comments below. I always like to learn from you, hopefully, as you guys learn from me. So let's start off with the Glock Generation 1. This particular example was imported into the United States in 1987. The Glock Generation 1s have a few features. Number one is a pebble texture, which goes all the way around the grip. You'll notice that the extractor does not have the loaded chamber indicator that we have on many of the modern Glocks. The finish of the slide is the Glock original Tenifer finish, which is a little bit different than the current modern finishes. Something else about the Generation 1s that some people do not know is that they were originally imported with a non-captive guide rod and recoil spring. So if I take this out, you will notice that I can take the guide rod off of the recoil spring. Now the modern ones will fit these, but the original ones will have a setup just like this, and these are actually a little bit difficult to put back in the gun, and the captive ones are definitely a lot better. So as you can see, it's a little bit more difficult, and they still go back together exactly the same. Something else to notice is that while I do not have an example of every type of magazine that Glock has made over the years, I do try to keep certain guns with period correct magazines, and this is a Generation 1 magazine. You'll notice some markings on the side. The witness holes in the back are a lot smaller, and you do have a U-cut in the back as well. So this magazine came with this gun originally, and that is a Generation 1. Now, some of you may know that Glock recently offered a reproduction of the P80 pistol. Now this is a limited run gun that was offered through Lipsy's, which is one of the big distributors of firearms here in the US. They asked Glock to reissue this gun, and it is my understanding that they had actually thrown away the molds for the Generation 1 frame. So they had to reverse engineer the frame from other Generation 1s, but they tried to copy it exactly. You'll notice that the extractor does not have the loaded chamber indicator. We have the same type of finish. The magazines that came with them are more modern magazines, so that's something that they did not copy. And this does use a captive recoil spring. But if you want to get a Generation 1, these can be kind of pricey and often are not in great shape. If you can find one of these P80 reissues, they do put on the original markings on them, and you get a pretty simulated experience of a Generation 1. Now let's move on to the Generation 2. Now, one of the complaints of the Generation 1 was the grip. These can be quite slippery. So you'll notice on the front strap and on the back strap, we have a checkering. And this is a Generation 2 without the finger grooves. As I mentioned, we still have the original Tenifer finish. This does have a captive guide rod and recoil spring. Now this particular one was imported in about 1994 after the enaction of the assault weapons ban during the Clinton era. So one thing about the magazine that came with this one is it is a restricted law enforcement only magazine, and it holds 17 rounds. So it has the marking on it that was required during that time period. This particular example has the original sights that Glock imported most of their pistols with at the time. They often punch these out and put in the sights that we all know and love or hate depending on your personal preference. And the reason that they do this is for importation. In order for it to get enough points for importation, a adjustable rear sight gives it more points, and therefore the gun can be imported. But as I mentioned, many times you'll find people advertising Generation 2s as Generation 1s. They know they're old, but they don't know the difference. So if you ever see one with the checkering on the back strap and the front strap, you know it is a Generation 2. Then, a Generation 3, we get the finger groove. Some people love it, some people hate it. The checkering on the back strap is pretty much the same. We have the same pebble texture on the side, and we do get the checkering in between the finger grooves. As I said, some people love those, and some people hate those. Another difference between the Generation 3 and the previous generations, because at this time they were starting to come out with more powerful calibers in the frames, we now have 2 pins in the frame. Now, some early Generation 3s had a single pin. If we go back to the Generation 2, we have a single pin, and the Generation 1, we have a single pin. But now that they have 40 and more powerful cartridges, the locking block needed to have an extra pin for durability. So most of the Generation 3s will have a 3-pin frame. Now you may notice that this gun has some suppressor height sights and a threaded barrel. This is actually a Glock 17 TB for threaded barrel. It is a factory Glock barrel and factory sights. And this is an option that was offered for a number of years. It is not an aftermarket add-on, and yes, Glock over the years has offered threaded barrels. I have not seen them very often. They're very limited in run, but the frame and the slide itself are just like you would see on any Generation 3. And I just like having this in the collection because it's the only factory threaded barrel Glock that I personally own. And now we're going to move on to the Generation 3.5, otherwise known as the RTF2 frame. As you'll notice, we have some different serrations here in the back. And so once again, one of the complaints people had with the grip frame is that these were too slippery and they wanted something more aggressive. During this era, people were putting on those Talon grips with the sandpaper feel, and some people wanted that on a factory Glock without having to apply it themselves. So this essentially uses a Generation 3 frame with a much rougher texture. That's what RTF stands for. These fish gill serrations were added for easier purchase or more purchase on the slide. This particular example is a Glock 22 chambered in 40, and the main market for these RTF2 frames was law enforcement. So they did offer these in the Glock 17, the Glock 19, the Glock 22, and the Glock 23, which is the 9mm and the 40 caliber pistols, both in the full size and compact respectively. So some people also refer to this as the Generation 3.5 or the RTF2 frame. Then we move on to the Generation 4. Many people didn't like the RTF2 frame because it was too aggressive. So they went to this pyramid type of texture, which is a little bit less aggressive, but definitely more aggressive than you would find on the Generation 3. As you can see, we do have a 3-pin frame on this, and by this generation and the Generation 3, I should show, we do have a loaded chamber indicator on the extractor. So this loaded chamber indicator is for a tactile feel to know if it's loaded and not a visual one, and that's one of the upgrades between Generation 2 and Generation 3. Now, another controversial addition to this generation was the fact that they went to a dual recoil spring. So if I take this apart, you will notice that the recoil spring is actually 2 recoil springs, and this is not reverse compatible because the front of the slide is larger to accommodate this one. So you don't have 100% parts compatibility between those 2 generations. We also see a change in the magazine catch, which is also now reversible. The other big addition in the Generation 4 was the MBS frame, or the multiple backstrap. Now, I don't have any of the backstraps on this one. I like the way this gun feels without them, but the back here actually has grooves that you can add. There's a small, medium, and large. They might even have some now that are bigger or smaller than that, and ones that have beaver tails, but I kind of like just the stock feel of this one. And that is the Generation 4. You'll also notice that throughout the years, the color of the finish on the slide has changed. Due to environmental protection laws, they can't apply the Tenifer finish here in the United States. So they've had to come up with some other finishes that look the same and are supposed to be just as durable. Now let's move on to the Generation 5. Now the Generation 5 is one of my favorite, along with the Generation 2, because now we see we've gotten rid of the finger grooves. We keep the texture from the Generation 4. We still have those little pyramids there. We do have the multiple backstrap system as well. But the removal of the finger grooves, I think, is a huge upgrade and addition. You'll also notice that due to customer demand, we now have a slide stop, which is ambidextrous on both sides. And of course, the magazine catch is also reversible. This also retains the captive recoil spring, which is a dual recoil spring from the Generation 4. And you'll notice that they have rounded the edges on the front of the slide. And this mirrors what they do on the Glock 26 and Glock 27 subcompacts. I actually think that is really nice, and it looks a lot better in my personal opinion. Now, there is actually a gun between the Generation 4 and the Generation 5 that some people call the Generation 4.5, I would assume, and that is this gun right here. It is marked as a Glock 17M, and this is the gun that I think the Generation 5 was modeled after, and this is a gun that was designed in collaboration with the FBI. They wanted to have a new contract for new pistols. They didn't like the Generation 4, and so Glock worked with them, and this is what they came up with. On the outset, it looks just like a Generation 5, but the slide is marked as 17M. They all came with Ameriglow Agent sights. Some of them were made in Austria. This particular example was made in the US. And the other thing about the 17M is the internal coatings on many of the parts are different, and those actually have different part numbers. And these were offered in the Glock 17 and the Glock 19. You'll also notice in the Generation 5 on the 17M as well, we go back to a single pin frame. So they went back in time, got rid of the finger grooves, and went back to the single pin. So that is the 17M. And that's the 5 generations, and I guess we'll call them the sub-generations. I've already talked about the P80 we have here. Now, another option that Glock has offered over the years, I believe only in the Generation 3 and the Generation 4, is a compensated model. Now, this is my personal Glock 21C. I have outfitted it with some suppressor height sights, obviously, and an Olight light and laser, but as you can see on the top of the frame here, it is cut out and it is compensated. So we have gas that comes out in a V pattern, coming out this way and that way, and these compensators are really nice because they do not get any soot or debris on that front sight. As I said, to my knowledge, these have only ever been offered in the Generation 3 and the Generation 4, and only on certain models. In the Generation 3, I believe it was the G17, G19, G20, G21, the 22, 23, and I believe the 31 and 32. And That's their standard compensator on those models. Now, if you are knowledgeable or have ever seen a Glock 18C, which of course is their famous fully automatic pistol, the compensator looks quite different. It has a cutout in the top, and the compensator usually has 3 or 4 ports which point forward instead of to the side. And I have an example of that type of porting. Here I have a Glock 24 Gen 3 with the compensated barrel up here. Now this obviously is in a B&T chassis. This is a registered short-barreled rifle. I really like these B&T chassis. They're really cool. But this is an example of that ported barrel. This is just like what the G18 would look like. And as you can see, we have 4 ports up here, and they all point to the front. And when you shoot this a bunch, your front sight is going to get absolutely filthy. That's a huge downside to that type of compensation. But when it comes to this, and especially being chambered in 40, you get almost no recoil whatsoever. But you definitely feel the concussion on your face. Those ports definitely work really well. The other thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to Glocks and the various generations is if you really go and look at all of their different models, you'll notice that there are a few model numbers that you might not be able to buy or find out what they are. Typically, you're going to find the Glock 25, the Glock 28, and the Glock 46 all fit this category. Now, the Glock 25 is the same as the Glock 19, but it was chambered in 380, and this is a Glock 28 chambered in 380. And these two guns were initially designed for countries where civilians were not allowed to own military calibers. Many people did not want this type of a gun in the US because it's only in 380, and this is double stack. Glock later came out with a US-made Glock 42, which was chambered in 380, but it was single stack and much thinner. But these guns were designed for a different market. Now, the way I got this one is that through Lipsy's, once again, they had a limited run of US-made 380 Glock 28s. Now, these are unavailable for import because the gun is too small and chambered in too small of a caliber to be imported from another country, but they can be made here in the United States. And you'll notice that the barrel hood is a little bit different. And normally, if you look on YouTube or try to find videos or information on these guns, you'll pretty much find sources from Mexico or Brazil. They're very popular guns down there. And the Glock 25, as I said, is the bigger brother to this, about the size of the Glock 19. The other model that you'll notice you cannot buy is the Glock 46, and I don't have anything like that here, and I've never even seen one in person, and it is a version of the Glock that has a rotating barrel. All of these use a variation of the Browning tilting barrel action, but there was a police contract in Germany where they wanted a rotating barrel, and it's the Glock 46. If you ever get a moment, go check it out. It's extremely rare and really mechanically very different than any of the Glocks that you can buy or see on this table. And I kind of hope that one day they will import them or make them here in the US, because I really would like to have one to complete my collection. So I hope this video helps somebody in the future. I tried to talk about everything I know about these guns, the different variances and variables and options that you might find on a Glock in the wild. And I also especially wanted to educate people on the differences between the Generation 1 and the Generation 2, because often at gun shows or on the used market, you'll see Generation 2s advertised as Generation 1s because people just don't know better. Remember, if it has a checkered front strap and a checkered back strap, it is a Generation 2. The Generation 1s are much rarer and have that pebble texture all the way around the grip. So once again, I hope this video helps somebody in the future. Hopefully you learned something, and if I missed something, please be sure to mention it in the comments. So, as always, thanks for watching.